Greetings all, Chieftain here. A little while back, Spookston sent me the script for what you were about to see and wondered if I'd be interested in doing a foreword for him. A little intro, shall we say. Absolutely. Because I'm always happy to see another YouTube tank historian come on the line and continue to evangelically spread the word of the tank to all and sundry. Now, Spookston's got a little bit of a niche going here. So if you want the absolute in-depth detail on something and you're willing to sit down for an hour to listen to it, come to my channel. Not everybody has that level of time or interest. And from what I can read, Spookston's little series that he's going to start seems to be the, well, let's call it the 10-minute version. And this isn't to detract from the basic quality of the information which is being provided, because unlike a lot of the other videos, 10-minute, 5-minute videos that you find on YouTube on, let's say, the Sherman tank, he's not just repeating the popular knowledge. He's going in, he's doing a little bit of digging, and he's coming up with his own conclusions instead of just what is most likely to get the clicks. And that in itself should probably get a few clicks. So anyway, he started off with the M4, probably one of the most maligned tanks, unjustifiably, I would argue, maligned tanks that has ever been put into mass service. And why not? It's a good enough start as any, and it's a good litmus test for the quality of the videos which will follow. So that said, I will leave you to it. I'm not going to take up the entire video for Spookston, so enjoy.
With the fall of France in 1940, the US Army decided that their current medium tank, the M2A1, was inadequate for the coming war. As a result, development began on a replacement vehicle. It was decided that the new tank should carry a 75mm gun, though it would take some time to make a fully rotating turret capable of housing such a gun. As a stopgap measure, the replacement vehicle would carry the 75mm in the hull. Along with the 75mm would be a 37mm anti-tank gun and a fully rotating turret. Development on the new vehicle was carried out between August of 1940 and January of 1941. In April of 1941, the new vehicle, now designated the M3 medium tank, began rolling off of production lines. It was suggested that the M3 should enter limited production until a turret housing the 75mm could be developed. The British committee objected, as the bulk of their tank force had been lost at Dunkirk, and they were in desperate need of replacements. A production plan was laid out which put the M3 in full production while a new tank was developed. This replacement vehicle would use as many parts of the M3 as possible to simplify production. In February of 1941, design work began on the M3's replacement. The new tank would have a turret-mounted 75mm gun, and a cast hull instead of the riveted hull utilized on the M2 and M3. The pilot for this vehicle, designated the T6, was delivered to Aberdeen in September of 1941. The T6 was an odd mix of new and old concepts. It boasted fire control equipment that was unparalleled even up to the end of the war, yet also retained such archaic ideas as side hull doors and fixed machine guns in the whole front. The main gun was equipped with a gyro stabilizer nearly identical to the one used in the M3. After inspection of the pilot vehicle, a number of changes were made which removed the side hull doors and the cupola which had been present on the mock-up. After these amendments, the T6 was deemed fit for service and designated as the M4 medium tank in October of 1941. In February of 1942, the M4 entered full production. The M4 had 50mm of armor sloped at 57 degrees, weighed 30 metric tons combat loaded, and was powered by a 400 horsepower radial engine. The armament consisted of an M3 75mm gun and two 30 caliber machine guns. The first M4s were produced at the Lima locomotive plant in Ohio. It became apparent that casting all of the hulls was not feasible at the time, so a workaround was established that would construct some M4s with welded hulls. Cast hull M4s were designated M4A1s, while welded hull M4s retained the simple M4 designation. Later versions would see the front hull thickness increase to 63.5mm at 46 degrees. In early 1942, the two fixed machine guns in the whole front were removed, and a 50 caliber machine gun was mounted to the roof. The large engine bay meant that a wide variety of engines could be mounted in the M4's chassis. Several variants with differing power plants were developed for reasons of engine availability and Lend-Lease requirements. as the US military indexing system would often allow for duplicate items. For simplicity, the British started applying names to equipment. The M4 was christened the Sherman after the Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. The name was officially accepted by the US military in 1944. The M4 first saw use with the British in the Second Battle for El Alamein in Africa, and performed very well, with British crews praising the M4. The M4's success can be attributed to a number of novel features. It was a veritable jack of all trades. It was extremely reliable since a large number of components had already been tried and improved on previous tanks. The components were also easy to access and replace, making the M4 easy to maintain in field conditions. The large, vertically opening hatches allowed the crew to exit the vehicle quickly in the case of a penetrating hit. The M4's largest advantages were in its fire control equipment. The main gun had a periscopic sight which allowed the gunner to scan for targets while in a turret down position, which is a big plus in hilly terrain. The commander's station was fitted with an override for the turret traverse mechanism, which he could use to manually put the gunner onto a target, decreasing the time it took to engage a target. Perhaps the M4's best tool was the gyroscopic stabilizer. Though the stabilizer allowed the M4 to fire accurately while moving up to 15 miles an hour, its most useful feature was for allowing better first shot accuracy when coming to a halt. Though the M4 certainly had a lot going for it, it was not without its flaws. During action in Africa, it was noted that M4s tended to catch fire rather easily. Many believe the fires to be a symptom of the gasoline fuel used for the engines. However, the issue was identified as a problem with improper ammunition stowage, and one which many of the M4's contemporaries also shared. A British report concluded that early M4s had an 82% burn rate, while Panzer IVs had an 80% burn rate. American units reported around 60 to 80%. The short-term solution was to add more armor to ammunition stowage. The long-term solution was to add wet ammunition stowage to new M4s. After these additions, burn rates sharply declined, with wet stowage tanks having burn rates ranging from 10 to 15%. Another problem which reared its head was the poor distribution of ground pressure. Over soft terrain, this meant that the M4 was more likely to sink into the earth. The short-term solution was to provide track extensions, also known as extended end connectors, that brought the ground pressure to acceptable levels. The long-term solution was to manufacture new M4s with a horizontal volute spring suspension, which not only greatly decreased the ground pressure, but also provided a more stable platform. The lack of a loader's hatch in the turret was also a fairly large issue, since it increased the time it took for all of the crew to escape. In October of 1943, M4s with loader's hatches began coming off of production lines. Retrofit kits were also given out so the crew stuck with tanks that did not have loader's hatches could install one on their vehicle. The design of the M4 in the large industrial base of the United States allowed the M4 to be produced in massive quantities. The military worked closely with industrial companies to make sure production was as smooth as possible. The M4 was the second most produced tank during World War II, being surpassed by the Soviet T-34. Roughly 49,000 M4s were produced throughout the war, with nearly 22,000 of those being given to Allied nations via the Lend-Lease program. The M4 would become the most widely used Allied tank of World War II, seeing use on every front of the war. In the Western European theater, the American and British armies used the M4 to great effect. The 75 proved to be an effective multi-purpose gun up until mid-1944, when Panthers became about as common as Panzer IVs. Only then was the 75 deemed inadequate. Though the Panther's front was nearly impenetrable to the 75, the Panther's sides were easily exploitable. Luckily for M4 crews, most tank-on-tank combat occurs when one side flanks another. An estimated 69% of hits to Panthers were against the side and rear armor. M4 crews devised alternative methods of taking out tougher tanks when all else failed. From battering the tank into submission with high explosive shells, to burning them with white phosphorus. Firing white phosphorus shells against armored targets became standard operating procedure in some units. However, it was rightfully decided that the 75 was no longer sufficient in the anti-tank role. Though tanks only accounted for about 14% of targets that M4s engaged, the lack of a high-velocity gun more capable of dealing with Panthers head-on was dealing blows to crew morale, regardless of how particular of a circumstance it was. Development of an upgunned M4 began as early as August of 1942, with the M476M1. The 76M1 was a standard M4 with a cut-down 3-inch gun mounted in the turret. In April of 1943, the 76M1 was declared unfit for service, and work began on creating a better upgunned M4. In July of 1943, Aberdeen Proving Ground received a new vehicle for testing, designated the M4E6. The M4E6 pilot saw the standard turret replaced with one from the experimental T-23 medium tank. In February of 1944, 76mm versions for the standard chassis types were type classified and entered production. In April of 1944, the first 76mm M4s arrived in England, for distribution to forces that would partake in the invasion of Normandy. Commanders were not impressed with the apparent trade-offs of the new vehicle. It was decided that the new 76mm M4s would be left in England. After the Panther was encountered in larger quantities than expected, units began to request the 76mm M4s. The first 76mm M4s were received by units in August of 1944. The idea of producing a 90mm M4 had been kicked around as early as 1943, but faced major opposition. Eventually, one pilot vehicle was constructed which dropped the turret from an M26 Pershing, then known as the T-26, onto the chassis of the M4A3. The vehicle was scrapped because of a number of concerns, among them being that the Ordnance Department didn't want their pet project, the T-26, to have competition. Instead of developing a 90mm M4, 76mm high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition was created and delivered to the theater. Though this new ammo was at first only available in limited quantities, it greatly improved the effectiveness of the M4s armed with the 76. In the Pacific, the M4 was practically uncontested. The Japanese tanks the M4 squared up against, such as the Ha-Go and Shi-Ha, were 1930s designs which were not only mechanically inferior, but numerically inferior as well. Though these Japanese designs were perfectly suitable, and in some respects even advanced for their time, they were simply outmatched. Comparable Japanese designs were manufactured in extremely small quantities and never left the home islands. Though Japanese tanks themselves were a non-issue, their anti-tank guns were not. In ambushes, high-velocity 47mm guns wreaked havoc against M4s in the late war period. On the Eastern European front, the M4 again slugged it out with its German counterparts, but now crewed by Soviet tankers. The Soviet units that received the M4 liked it quite well, affectionately referring to it as the Emcha. The nickname Emcha was derived from the Russian way of saying M4. 4,063 M4A2s were shipped to the Soviet Union, with 2,073 being armed with the 76mm. The Soviet Emcha regiments cut their way through Eastern Europe, all the way to Austria, before being dispatched to Manchuria by train. While the war raged on, the M4 was used as a testbed for a plethora of new equipment. In 1943, an A65 V12 gasoline engine was installed in an M4A4 for testing. To fit the engine, the rear hull had to be extended by 9.5 inches. The A65 developed 650 gross horsepower, and originally delivered 549 net horsepower to the M4's powertrain. The compression ratio was later adjusted to provide a net horsepower of 580. After testing showed no serious defects in the system, it was decided that more research should be done to develop more engines with similar levels of power. To improve the M4's reverse speed, a planetary gearbox was tested which allowed the M4 to reverse at 21 miles per hour, or 33 kilometers per hour. The gearbox was tested in 1945 and approved for service, but further development was halted once the war came to an end. Additionally, the effectiveness of the M4's gyroscopic stabilizer led to tests in azimuth stabilization systems. Dual-axis stabilizers were built and tested by both the IBM Corporation and the Ordnance Department. In comparative tests, both systems were found to be better than the gyroscopic stabilizer, with the IBM design being the best of the three. Though the IBM design was technically superior, the Ordnance design used pre-existing components and could be more readily integrated. The Ordnance stabilizer saw further testing on an M4A376. The system was far from perfect, suffering from reliability and vibration issues, but continued to be worked on post-war. With the end of World War II, it was believed that the M4 had just about served its purpose, but the M4 would again become the Army's workhorse when conflict broke out in Korea. In June of 1950, a massive North Korean offensive swept south, spearheaded by T-34s, and virtually unopposed. M4s were gathered from reserve units in Japan before being shipped over to Korea in order to halt the advance. M4s exacted a devastating toll on North Korean armor, accounting for 46% of T-34s knocked out by US tanks. The M4 continued to be used in the infantry support role until 1953, when the Korean War finally drew to a close. In 1957, the M4 was officially retired from service in the United States military. After being withdrawn from service in the US, The M4 continued to see service with a number of Western aligned nations. The most prominent examples were the Israeli M50 and M51 Shermans. The last conflict the M4 was known to have participated in was the Iran-Iraq War, which started in 1980 and ended in 1988. The last M4 was officially retired from worldwide service in April 2018, when Paraguay ceased using them. To say that the M4 is a controversial tank would be an understatement. Its role and relative quality have been a matter of debate since 1944, when US armored units were put through hell during the Battle of the Bulge. Traditionally, the M4 has had a bad reputation, though recently it has been swinging the other way. The M4 will likely always be a center of intense debate, but at least now the average person has a better understanding of the M4's true nature.